Y'all have probably seen the videos talking about kids can't read nowadays, seventh graders reading at a fourth grade level, kids don't know their ABCs, kids can't read, and I wanted to talk about that. And the thing is, it's not just kids. 20% of adults in the United States are illiterate. Over 50% of adults can't read past an eighth grade level, so it's not just the kids.
Hey guys, I'm Hannah Cox with BASEDPolitics, and you're watching my show, Hannah Explains It All, where every week I help you better understand the political, legal, and social climate you're living in. In case you haven't been keeping up, Americans have been rapidly falling behind the competition across just about every academic front for several years now. And before we go any further on this subject whatsoever, I'm going to go ahead and nip it in the bud because I know inevitably the excuse that will come the minute I say that. And that excuse is that we are underfunding our public schools. This is a tired talking point that you will hear from many on the Democratic side of the political aisle. You'll hear it from teachers and teachers unions. You'll hear it from pretty much all of the people who are leeching off the public school system, but it is 100% false, and I will bring you the receipts to prove it. The United States actually spends 6% of our GDP on education, and not only is that a ton of money, it is a far larger percentage of our GDP than you see being spent in European nations, where they average about 4.85% of their GDP on educational spending. Furthermore, we spend about $15,000 per kid per year on average in the United States. What that means is that in many districts, when you dig in, we spend far more than $15,000 per year. Depending on the state and the city and the locality, the funding can change, but some districts you'll find them spending even $25,000, $30,000 per year per kid. That is an astronomical amount of money, and it is far more than what most private schools charge. Yes, some private schools charge a lot of money too, but most of them are not charging those rates. Now, the problem with this scenario is that we are spending a lot of money. We are spending a lot of money per kid, but it clearly isn't making its way into the classroom. The average teacher salary also differs greatly based on the funding in each school district, but the national averages range from about $46,887 per year to $68,511 per year. So if the money's not going to the teachers and it's not going into the classrooms, because if you look lately, parents are being asked to provide a whole portfolio of materials every school year, you have to ask where it's going. And where it's mostly going are to teachers' unions, the Democratic Party via donations, administrations, infrastructure, meaning like big fancy football stadiums, and just general bloat. And the reason for that is that there is zero accountability. When you have a monopoly on an entity, which is what we see with public education, there are no incentives or disincentives to actually keep control of the situation. They know the government will just keep throwing more money at the problem, and there's nothing holding them to account on how they spend it, if it's actually producing better results, and we know that it's not because our test scores keep going down and our IQs keep falling. But ultimately, there's little that can be done about it because most people are forced to participate in the system. Unless you have the ability to pay for an education twice for your kid, you have to use the public school system because you are already having your money forcibly taken by the government and invested there. I'll circle back to that a little bit later in this episode. Now, what's important to know is that test scores and IQs and all of these things were falling long before COVID, but the pandemic accelerated what was already going on. When they shut down schools for the amount of time that they did, they exacerbated all of these issues, compounded them, and created a situation where many kids are never going to be able to catch up for that time. And as predicted, the kids that are hurt the most by this are those that were already on the margins. Recent results from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP, which is a huge yearly report, showed historic declines in American students' knowledge and skills and widening gaps between the highest and lowest scoring students since the pandemic. Now, I want to actually dig into this assessment. The Brookings Institution did a bit of a deep dive into it, and they had some interesting takeaways I think are worth noting. First, they note that students lost critical opportunities to learn and thrive during the shutdowns. They say the typical American student lost several months' worth of learning in language arts and more in mathematics. Students suffered crushing increases in anxiety and depression. More than 1 in 360 U.S. children lost a parent or caregiver to COVID-19. They also say students poorly served before the pandemic were profoundly left behind during it, including many with disabilities whose parents reported they were cut off from essential school and life services. They note that this deeply traumatic period threatens to reverberate for decades. The academic, social, and mental health needs are real, they are measurable, and they must be addressed quickly to avoid long-term consequences to individual students, the future workforce, and society. Secondly, they note that the average effects from COVID mask dire inequities and widely varied impacts. Some students are catching up, but time is running out for others. Every student experienced the pandemic differently, and there is tremendous variation from student to student, with certain populations, namely Black, Hispanic, and low-income students, as well as other vulnerable populations suffering the most severe impacts. And I want to just pause here and note, we told you so. The people that were against shutting down schools, which were the Republicans and the Libertarians, for the record, predicted this all along.
Is there a point in which kids have been out of physical in-person school for so long that the education that they've lost isn't really recoverable? That the third grade, the fourth grade, the kindergarten they lost, they can take extra semesters in the summer, but it can't really be fixed?
No, I don't believe that.
And the research isn't as clear about that. What we can do about it is the big question, and that's the problem with the term learning loss, is that it becomes conflated, it becomes confused, and the remedies put in place may not be the appropriate remedies. Simply opening schools isn't necessarily going to be enough to address any content that was missed and whether we have the expectations that the students catch up with those things and get back on schedule that they were previously on.
Of learning loss in the pandemic and the toll on kids, she said this, quote, "Our kids didn't lose anything. It's okay that our babies may not have learned all their times tables. They learned resilience. They learned survival. They learned critical thinking skills. They know the difference between a riot and a protest. They know the words insurrection and coup." Oh, what a bunch of condescending hog slop.
And they were called racist, they were called misogynistic, they were called supremacists, they said that they didn't care about people's lives. The list of insults hurled at people who advocated keeping schools open, with a lot of scientific data to back that up, I might add, were pretty heinous, and they also were completely false. We said all along that there would be horrific consequences to that decision, and that decision was absolutely politically motivated. I don't know if I need to remind you, but the teachers' unions held the school system hostage and often were demanding a whole list of public policy agenda items to get them to open back up that had absolutely nothing to do with education. We saw some districts demanding that they defund the police before they would reopen. They wanted universal health care for all. The list goes on. It was a disgusting and grotesque campaign to utilize a pandemic against the American people, and now we're going to have to pay for the results of it because they got away with it. Let's go back to the Brookings Institution's report. They go on to note that the effects were more severe where campuses stay closed longer. American students are experiencing a K-shaped recovery in which gaps between the highest and lowest scoring students, already growing before the pandemic, are widening into chasms. In the latest NAEP results released in September, national average scores fell 5 times as much in reading and 4 times as much in math for the lowest scoring 10% of 9-year-olds as they had for the highest scoring 10%. And they note that at the pace of recovery we are seeing today, too many students of all races and income levels will graduate in the coming years without the skills and knowledge needed for college and careers. Now, all of this is damning enough, but their third point is even worse, where they note that what we know as of right now is still incomplete. They admit the situation could be significantly worse than the early data suggest. They say that the data and stories we have to date are enough to warrant immediate action, but there are serious holes in our understanding of how the pandemic has affected various groups of students, especially those who are typically most likely to fall through the cracks in the American education system. We know little about students with complex needs, such as those with disabilities and English learners. We still know too little about the learning impacts in non-tested subjects such as science, civics, and foreign languages. And while psychologists, educators, and the federal government are sounding alarms about a youth mental health crisis, systemic measures of student well-being remain hard to come by. And fourthly, they note that the harm students experience can be traced to a rigid, inequitable system that puts adults, not students, first. I love that they admit this. I personally don't follow the Brookings Institution all that closely. I'm not sure exactly of what their partisan lens is, but this is something I have highlighted for some time, including in many of my YouTube videos. The public school system is not only a colossal failure, it is one of the most racist institutions in our country. And this is one of those things when people talk about systemic racism and the right melts down, I'm like, why are you guys upset? The government sucks. It's awful. It's bad at everything it does. The idea that it is racist is not like far-fetched or out there. And if you dig into the history of public policy, if you know anything about the history of public policy, you know that many of our systems were put in place with racist intentions. You can see this all over gun control, for example, which I've also done an episode on. But the public school systems were designed to put kids into a system based on their zip codes. And the funding allocated to the schools are also based on those zip codes. So if you know how zip codes were determined throughout history with things like redlining that determined where certain people got to live and purchase homes and where certain people could not, then you understand that our school system has been trapping certain demographics in cycles of poverty and poor education for decades. It is absolutely an inequitable system. It absolutely prioritizes the adults that benefit from the system over the kids. The kids increasingly get worse and worse outcomes. They have worse and worse environments. The only people benefiting are the ones whose paychecks are getting larger, despite the fact that they are not producing better results. You would never see this happen in a private market capitalist system. This is allowed to happen because the government is running the schools. The Brookings Institution notes that despite often heroic efforts by caring adults, students and families were cut off from essential support, offered radically diminished learning opportunities, and left to their own devices to support learning. Too often, partisan politics, not student needs, drove decision-making, and students with complexities and differences too often face systems immobilized by fear and a commitment to sameness rather than prioritization and problem solving. So this was all obviously very, very bad, but I do think the one silver lining we've seen throughout this whole ridiculous episode is that it enabled parents to actually see what was happening or not happening in their kids' classrooms and begin to wake up to the broader problems in the school system and demand change. I have been working on legislation known as school choice long before COVID, dating all the way back to 2016. And it has always been an uphill battle to pass it because naturally we are going up against the government. The government is very well funded. It has a lot of means at its disposal, and it is able to donate a lot of money to Democrat and Republicans who will do its bidding. Now, how this looks typically is that the teachers' unions collect a paycheck from the teachers' salaries, and they then funnel that into various politicians' campaigns, and they tell them how to vote, and they act accordingly. And while teachers' unions tend to give a lot more money to Democrats than Republicans, they have spent pretty big on Republican lawmakers when it comes to this issue because they want to stop it, because they want to keep their monopoly on education. Not only do they want to keep their monopoly on education because it financially benefits them, they want to keep their monopoly on education because they want to be able to indoctrinate your kids and dictate their politics and dictate what they learn and what they don't. Now, what happened during COVID is that these people played themselves because they got greedy. They tried to do a grab bag and get all these other issues that had nothing to do with schools. And in the process, they actually enabled parents who were very busy, who didn't get to sit in the classrooms, who didn't understand the things their kids were being taught, to actually look in and see what was going on and recognize that they disagreed with many of the viewpoints being pushed, that their kids were not getting a sound education. They realized that their education dollars were being held hostage and there was nothing they could do about it. And they started showing up en masse to support school choice. Now, I'm not going to go on a huge tangent here. I've made lots of videos on school choice if you want to dig more into how they work. But basically, these policies let parents keep a portion of the funds that are currently being doled out to these schools and use them however they see best for educational purposes for their kid. So if they want to reinvest in the public school system, cool, great, they can. I think that's bonkers, but go for it. Or if they want to take those dollars and actually pay for private school or homeschool or for tutors or for online classes, they're allowed to do that too. It's a policy that actually introduces competition back into the education system and demands that schools actually produce something worth paying for if they want to get those dollars. Since the pandemic, we have seen a tidal wave of support for school choice, and we've seen a number of states enacting these policies. You need to be paying attention to this issue if you're a parent or if you expect to be a parent anytime in the near future. They're really exciting. There's a lot of momentum behind them, and typically they're moving at the state level. And that's honestly the only way I see any of this getting any better whatsoever. It's the only shot at all. And I care a lot about this despite the fact that I don't have kids, because I believe, as our founders did, that this whole experiment, this whole idea of a constitutional republic, it only works if you have an educated population. That's what our founder said. This will only work as long as you have an educated citizenry. And that's why I believe quite sinisterly that these failings in the government school systems are not always unintentional. I think the public school system is set up to predominantly indoctrinate people into one way of thinking. It's there to teach you what to think, not how to think. It's there to get you used to punching a clock and showing up for a certain time period and having to ask permission to go to the bathroom or do anything whatsoever. It's there to produce happy little workers who don't ask questions and don't push back against the system. The government certainly has no incentive to make sure that you are somebody who is logical, who is well equipped to fight back, who is well read about history and the atrocities of government. No, their incentive is to make you a happy little sheeple that won't push back and that will just happily pay taxes reliably. And this brings me to the crux of the subject that I want to discuss today, because while we see the school system consistently producing worse and worse results across all fronts, I think that the place this is most glaring is when it comes to the reading comprehension and literacy abilities of the American people. The United States has a growing epidemic of illiteracy, and if not full-fledged illiteracy, at least a dire inability to comprehend reading materials. And the reason this is so important is because reading is the foundation upon which so many other things are built. Not being able to read or even having shallow reading comprehension is going to impact every facet of your life, from your online interactions to your political involvement, even in your interpersonal relationship. It definitely is going to impact your ability to get a job, the kind of money you're going to make. And I want to show you a report so you know that I'm not exaggerating this problem. This is startling. 1 in 4 children in America are growing up without learning how to read. 32 million adults in the United States cannot read. 14% of U.S. adults are considered functionally illiterate. 21% of adults in the U.S. read below a 5th grade level. 19% of high school graduates in the U.S. can't read. 42 million U.S. adults can't read past a 5th grade level. 50% of adults in the U.S. can't read a book written at an 8th grade level. And as I said, this can impact virtually every facet of your life, but we know that people who cannot read are far more likely to fall into poverty and into crime. 43% of adults with low literacy actually live in poverty. 50% of adults with low literacy do not have a job. 85% of juvenile offenders have low literacy skills. And 3/4 of state prison inmates did not graduate high school. Lastly, 2/3 of students who cannot read proficiently by the end of 4th grade will end up in jail or on welfare at some point in their lives. Now, I was actually homeschooled the vast majority of my life. My mom obtained her teaching degree in Alabama when I was a young kid, and that is when she decided not to put me and my siblings in public schools. And I often thought that that was more for religious reasons. My dad's a pastor. I thought that probably had a lot to do more with like the environment they wanted me in. But later in life, as we were discussing it, I actually found out it had everything to do with the teachers she was training around. She told me that throughout the course of her college work, she realized many of her future colleagues were functionally illiterate themselves. They themselves could not read. And she knew that if she were to put us in the public school system, these are the kinds of people that would be teaching us. So she kept us home at great financial sacrifice to my family in order to ensure that we were given a quality education. One of the most important things my parents ever did for me. Now, ever since I was a kid, I have been somewhat aware of the fact that other Americans were not necessarily where my family was on reading. We prioritized reading in my family. We read together every night. I was reading full-blown chapter books by like age 5, 6. And I developed a lifelong love of reading and really just of self-education through that process. And it's always made me kind of sad that so many other Americans don't seem to have that at their disposal. I frequently find people my age who readily admit they don't read at all. No books a year. 0. That blows my mind. I went on vacation a few weeks ago on a cruise and read like 4 books. It was awesome. I was so pumped. I had so much free time. I think that this is very, very sad. Again, not only because of the political consequences, but really of the social consequences of that and the individual consequences. Reading makes you a much more well-rounded person. It educates you about worlds you may never see. It provides empathy and insight into the lives and plights and feelings of others that would be really hard to garner otherwise. It enables you to have a solid understanding of history and of the pitfalls other people have made so that you can help to avoid them yourself. It gives you a better understanding of history and of many of the pitfalls that have been made historically, not only so that you can avoid them yourself, but so that you can hopefully advocate against them at a systemic level. And so it's very, very sad to me that so many Americans are missing out on this. But what's even sadder is that it seems a lot of parents are completely oblivious to the fact that their kids are falling so far behind on this issue. And you don't just have to look at the stats to get this information. It is all over TikTok. The teachers are sounding the alarm. Let's watch a few.
These kids can't read. They can't decode. They have no vocabulary, no background knowledge. I've never seen anything like it. For context, for 8 years, I taught a self-contained program for significant language-based learning disabilities. Like, it was the most restrictive environment. It was the step before being sent to a specialized school. And my fifth graders with significant language-based learning disabilities could write better than non-disabled seventh graders can now. They can't write a sentence. They don't know what state they live in. They don't know what region of the country they're in. They have no background knowledge. Most of them don't know who the president is. They're coming to school with no background knowledge. They have very low skills. And yes, part of my job is to help them find those skills. And as a special education teacher, I'm obviously going to be working with students who require specialized instruction, but I'm not talking about specifically my students. I'm talking about students in the grade, period. And this was the case last year. They can't take notes. They can't even attend to a video. They can't even attend to a 3-minute video clip. I can play it. I can tell them what it's going to be about. I can summarize what the video did, and not a single one can tell me what the video was about.
No, y'all, can we talk about it? Can we please talk about it? Let's take a moment to discuss. Let's take a moment to debrief. Let's take a moment to unpack. So I'm not really understanding why they're not telling y'all. We all know that the world is behind, globally, because of the pandemic and stuff. But I don't understand why they're not stressing to y'all how bad it is. I'm not even trying to be funny, but these kids are... I'm going to just say this. I teach 7th grade. They are still performing on the 4th grade level. I don't care how you flip it, turn it, swing it, swindle it. They still performing on the 4th grade level. Ain't nobody talking about how they just keep moving, passing them on. They just keep passing them on, 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 passing them on. I can put as many zeros in this grade book as I want to. They're going to move that child to the 8th grade next year.
Not burned out until the 2nd semester, okay? Usually. That's when I approach burnout. Because we get Thanksgiving, we get Christmas, we get all these things. I am burned out. It's September. It has not been a full month yet. Has it been a full... No, it's close to a full month, but it has not been a full month yet. So let me tell you, you know what I'm talking about if you're teaching right now. I saw another teacher from another school across the street from our school walking to her car this afternoon, and she looked like she could barely walk to her car. And I was like, we're almost to Thanksgiving, trying to be friendly. And she was like, just unloaded on me. She's like, I've been teaching for 34 years. I have never had it this hard. What is wrong with these kids? Not in a bad way, but I don't know how to reach them. I feel like one lesson that used to take a day is taking a week now. Ooh, the attention span, blah, blah.
And I teach at one of the more affluent schools. When I tell you that these babies cannot read, they cannot write, and they cannot comprehend, I'm not being funny. I'm being dead serious. It doesn't exist. I have kids constantly asking me, how do I spell window? How do I spell important? How do I spell though? And they be serious. They're dead serious. I could ask them, who is the main character of your story? The story of 4-paragraph story we just read. Can't tell you. They don't know. They don't know. They don't know. It took us 4 weeks to get through how to answer a question in a complete sentence.
And basically, whenever I say kids can't read, they are reading at either a kindergarten or a 1st grade level. When it comes to spelling, I'm seeing a lot of children who can't even spell the word said, for, mother, father in the 4th or 5th grade, which makes me wonder what's going to happen when they're in middle school and high school.
The fact that I have 4th graders who cannot read independently at all is just one, what am I supposed to do? Because teachers are not miracle workers. If I'm required to teach 4th grade standards, the 4th grade standards do not include me teaching phonics. Now, I understand RTI, the MTSS process, and different safety nets like that, but doing that for 30 minutes a day is not going to solve the problem. So what is really the expectation? Are we just going to continue to fail the students and not teach them how to read? What is...
I think when people look at the failures of the education system, it can be really easy to immediately blame the teachers. And yes, there are some bad teachers in the system. And yes, the system does exist to protect them, particularly their unions. And that's one reason I don't think any public sector unions should be allowed. Unions in the private sector, fine. But if you're a government employee, you shouldn't be able to unionize and lobby against us, the American people who are paying your bills, and protect bad actors. That's true for policing, and that's also true for teachers. But I also think the vast majority of teachers mean well, are doing their very best, and are stuck in a very shitty system. After I had graduated, my mom actually went to teach in the public school system for a number of years, and I witnessed firsthand just what she was up against as a very good, equipped, caring teacher. She basically was punished if she held kids to account. She was consistently told to pass kids who had no business being passed. The principals and administrators would capitulate to parents who came in making outrageous demands. Parents were very often not involved in their kids' progress whatsoever, or even actively worked against the school and teachers who were trying to make sure they kept up. The teachers were judged and paid pretty much entirely based on the scores they were able to get on tests, which is teaching kids to test. It's not actually teaching them. Teachers who chose to go above and beyond and try to ensure kids were actually getting an education beyond just learning to memorize answers for a test were often penalized and bullied by other teachers. The whole system is corrupt and it sucks, and it got this way because of a lot of really bad public policy initiatives over the years. And one of those is something called No Child Left Behind, which was passed by Republican George W. Bush when I was a kid. Now, this policy actually got replaced by another very similar policy over the past couple of years, but it was in place for nearly 2 decades, and it has had very dire impacts on the education system. Watch.
No Child Left Behind was a federal policy under the Bush era between 2002 and 2015. And it made it so that it made it harder to keep kids back in grades. So before No Child Left Behind, if you could not read, all of your teachers would have a meeting with your parents and say, this kid doesn't know how to read, we're going to keep them back in 3rd grade. And you might be kept back in 3rd grade a couple of times until you learned how to read. Now you cannot do that. After No Child Left Behind, you had to do a lot of testing. You had to have several meetings with the parents. You had to have lots of documentation as to why this particular kid couldn't read. And if you couldn't prove that this kid couldn't read because of something that you didn't do, then that kid was pushed ahead. They got to go to the 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, 12th grade, even if they didn't know how to read.
We need to start leaving children behind. People don't understand what it used to feel like when you were a kid. And if you were bad enough in school and you failed, you would have to repeat an entire grade. We all had, at least a few times, 2 or 3 kids at the end of the year. If they were so bad in 2nd grade and 3rd grade, that they would have to repeat the whole grade. You don't get to not show up and fail everything you do and still move on to the next grade. That's not a thing. People need to start realizing the fear we used to have. I remember being a kid and I would see those kids have to repeat a grade, and I was terrified that that would be me. I did not want to watch all of my friends move on to the next grade while I stayed in 2nd grade, and I had to redo all that work I did in 2nd grade again because I did so bad in class. And that right there is enough motivation for parents and for kids to not ever fail their class, or at least give their best effort to not be so terrible.
Some kids need to get left behind, and as the second commentator there points out, many kids and their parents need the threat of getting left behind in order to make them really dig in and do the work. Continuing to just pass the buck on to the next year, the next teacher, all the way through graduation is doing nobody any favors. And ultimately, once you are past a certain age, it is a lot harder to go back and teach these very basic building blocks to somebody. These things need to be nipped in the bud when they are first recognized. They need to make sure that kids have the foundations they need before they move them on. This is not rocket science. And yet, this is how our education system has functioned for decades and probably will continue to. Now, the rates of illiteracy and the inability to read over certain grade levels are pretty dire enough, but I still don't even think we have scratched the full surface of what is going on here. Because I think there's an even bigger epidemic of people who can functionally read. They can see words on a page, they can sound them out, they can read, but they lack reading comprehension. The ability to read is a lot more than just sight words and being able to pronounce the words on the page.
A very interesting thing about this cultural and societal moment we're in, where we're realizing that people don't have reading comprehension skills, like very basic reading comprehension skills, is that people forget part of reading comprehension is being able to infer the intended audience of a piece of text without the author telling you directly. Did you know that you're supposed to be able to do that? You're supposed to be able to engage with a piece of text and say, I think the intended audience is blank. You are not supposed to need clarifications at the beginning of a text saying, now obviously I'm not talking about A, B, C, and D. You're supposed to be able to figure that out on your own, right? And so when you request those clarifications of saying, now make sure you say you're not talking about X, Y, and Z group, you lack reading comprehension skills. Does that make sense? Like, that's a skill you're supposed to have, and it seems like most people don't, and that goes hand in hand with reading comprehension.
Now that America has woken up to the fact that kids are not able to read at their grade level, I want to show you what it looks like to read at their grade level, or said specific grade level. So I gave this reading, mind you, it's a Spanish reading, for kids who are taking a pre-AP and a AP Spanish course at my school. Now, this is a college level course, and I have kids who are between 14 and 17 taking this course. At this level, kids should be able to give me a summary of this story, tell me about the characters, how are they characterized in this story, what are the relationships in this story, and a couple of inferences that they can make after reading this story. And tell me what is the main idea or message of the story. If kids at this level are unable to do that, that means they cannot read. And I think that most times, most parents think that if a kid can read a word, that means that your kid knows how to read. When in all actuality, reading is recognizing the word, saying the word, and also understanding what the text is saying and applying the text to real world situations. That is what reading is. So when it comes to this story that my students read, a lot of them, when I asked them what is the main idea, which is a question that can tell you a lot about how your students are reading, a lot of the kids said that the main idea of the story was that it's about a little girl who likes to talk a lot. When in actuality, yes, that is in the story, right? It is about a girl who does talk a lot. However, that is not the main idea of the story. And to me, that tells me that the kids read at a very surface level, not at the level that I want them to be reading, which is at a high school level. They're reading at a lower level. Granted, this wasn't all of the students, but literally more than 60% of the students answered that as the main idea, which tells me that they're reading at a lower level because, first of all, they were not able to recognize that the story has a message. And for the reader, it's important for them to get the message of the story because it's teaching a lesson. And they also have to understand that depending on what they're reading, every specific reading is going to have either a message or a purpose. And students need to understand that. Kids need to also be able to make meaning out of words that they don't know, phrases that they don't know. They need to pick out symbolism. How does symbolism help to make sense of the story? Characterization, irony, like all of these literary elements, they need to be able to pinpoint in order to be able to say that they are readers and reading at a high school or college level. So again, y'all, reading is not just saying a word. It's being able to say the word and understand what you're reading and making sense of it in order to apply it to the world. That is reading.
As somebody who makes my living creating content online, I have to read a lot of online comments and responses, and I witness this problem every single day. It makes me want to pull my hair out, the number of people who cannot read a simple paragraph, the questions they will have, the need to have you be more explicit to spell things out down to the tiniest detail for them, the inability to deduce who is being spoken to, who is not being spoken to, the number of people who will read something you write in plain English and come away with a completely different notion of what has been expressed. It is truly an impressive talent. I all the time, I'm just like, I don't think people can read. And now I'm recognizing that I'm not crazy. Americans really cannot read. And this is something that is so fundamental to our society, to our political system. It is no surprise that we are where we are at right now. People cannot have dialogue. They cannot engage in debate. They can't have meaningful conversations about important issues when they lack reading comprehension. And just to expand out a little bit on this subject briefly, I think that lack of reading comprehension actually translates to a much larger problem where they lack media literacy all together.
If her family is her literal life's work.
When people are always confused why there's controversy around Nara Smith, this is exactly why. And I think some of the problems have to do with media literacy and also men and women just thinking differently. Because women are watching this and they're very well aware that there are other people involved. Like this guy said, like, this woman lives for her family. Like, no, she loves to cook and she likes to do this stuff, but she lives for herself because she enjoys it. She's taking time in the morning, she's getting dressed, she's putting on makeup, she's putting on outfits. That is taking time where someone else is watching her child. Then she's making these full hour-long, it takes hours to film these videos while she's cooking, then editing them with no children around. So someone else is watching her children while someone else is also filming her. And I'm very aware while I'm watching that, when she makes a video and she's like, oh, my toddlers want a grilled cheese for lunch, and then starts making the bread. I know that that's not what the kids actually ask for, because she would have started having to make it at like 9 in the morning. You don't ask your kids, what do you want to eat? And then 3 hours later, give them their lunch. She already decided to make the grilled cheese, and then she made that into the content. And that's the problem. People don't seem to understand that. Like when she's like, oh, my husband was craving cookies and cream ice cream, and then the woman makes Oreo cookies by hand. Like, do you think her and her husband were sitting on the couch and he was like, oh, I want ice cream? She's like, wait 4 hours. Let me make it to you from hand. Like, no, she wanted to make ice cream, probably asked, hey, like, what's your favorite flavor? And then made her husband his favorite flavor. But the problem is men aren't seeing any of that. All men are seeing is a very pretty woman dressed up, laboring her butt off for her family. And then they're turning around to other women and saying, why aren't you more like her? But they're ignoring the fact that she's been modeling since she was like 15, so she's independently wealthy, that her husband takes care of the children as well. She is not a trad wife, that she has other people helping her, because you physically can't, like, there is someone filming her. You can see someone is filming her. But they're ignoring all that and they're just seeing this pretty woman. And then the only difficulty with Nara I see sometimes is I feel like she's very well aware of that. And that's why she always starts off her things, my husband wanted this, my toddlers wanted this. Like almost every video starts off like that. So it does feel like she is sort of pandering a little bit to this trad wife content, knowing that men who want women who basically just serve them are really going to like this content. Now, on the flip side of that, she is also allowed to be a beautiful woman who cooks. And she has mentioned, like, that Lucky is helped in other things and stuff like that. It's not like she completely hides it. And I do feel like recently she has been kind of making more videos about addressing some of that as well. But I think the main takeaway is Nara Smith isn't Nara Smith. She has a whole team, including her husband, who help her be Nara Smith. And that's the takeaway message that men need to get. She isn't doing all of this herself. She has a supportive partner who allows her to do this, and they both have money that allows them to do this, and they both have help that allows her to do this.
I know that might seem like a little bit of an offside tangent, so let me connect the dots here for what I'm seeing. People cannot tell what is fake news. They can't tell what is spin. They can't tell what is embellished. And I think that as we move into an era where everything is online, where you have things like AI creating things out of thin air online, that is a more important skill than ever. And if people were able to read, if they were actually getting reading comprehension, as the one educator said, and engaging with stories, they would learn to deduce some of these things. That is why reading is a pillar, a primary building block for all other education. Even if eventually you are no longer reading with your eyes and instead you're listening, or instead you're watching videos, you are using the same functionality in your brain to interpret story, to understand narrative, to pull out lessons from the material you're being given. When you lack reading comprehension, you're not learning to sharpen those skills as a young child. And so by the time you reach adulthood, you're going to be incredibly naive. You're probably going to be exceptionally obtuse, and you're not going to be able to meaningfully engage with ideas. All of that stems from reading. And so when you see the intense partisan divides, you see like the male-female gender wars going down, you see all of these issues swirling around society, some of them very big and intense and nuanced, and others quite petty. But either way, the people who are participating in them are tending to make things worse rather than typically coming together, working through things, finding commonality. And I think it's because they lack reading comprehension. Again, they've lacked the ability to gain insight into other people's experiences. They don't have historical context or information. They're not well read. Therefore, they are not strong thinkers. Therefore, they are not capable of participating in society and a political system as they should be as adults. Part of this is due to a failure by parents. You should know if your kid is falling behind in reading, but my theory is that a lot of parents don't know because they themselves are not strong readers. Part of this is due to a failure of teachers, but like I said, many of them are sounding the alarm. They're not getting support from the home. They're not getting support from the institution they work for, and so they don't have a lot of tools at their disposal to address the problem. But the majority of this problem is the system itself. It is the government's monopoly on education, on schools. And that system only cares about kids ultimately being able to pass a test. And because of that, that system has adopted terrible methodologies for teaching over the past couple of years. One of those methodologies that I'm very passionate about denouncing came from a woman named Lucy Calkins. And I want to roll you my own TikTok I made discussing her and her downfall last year.
Okay, I'm about to nerd out for a minute. Please join me. So growing up, I was mostly homeschooled, not like the Duggars, not taught math kind of homeschool. No, like the real kind of homeschool where we end up like 15 to 30% higher on standardized tests than public school kids. And one of the reasons for that is that my mom obtained her teaching degree in Alabama and was horrified by the curriculum and just like really low standards in public schools. And there was one particular point of contention that got brought up over and over when it came to the curriculum public schools used and why homeschooling was so superior. Like I could have told you about this when I was 4 or 5, and I'm confident no other 4 or 5-year-old had even ever heard these words. And it came down to how reading is taught in U.S. schools. Now, historically, and in most homeschool curriculums, they use an actual science to teach reading called phonics. Phonics is based on the way words sound. You're taught the different sounds of consonants and verbs and how different combinations sound, and you're taught like actual building blocks to read. And you employ things like sound and context in order to know how different words within English that can be used in multiple ways might be different in different sections of reading. You get the point. But in public schools, they had started using something that got away from phonics beginning in the 1980s. Instead of actually teaching kids to read, they were using sort of guesswork to have kids look at pictures or, flip back through the pages and kind of make a guess at what the words might say. And it turns out that most of this stemmed from a curriculum that was written by a woman named Lucy Calkins. And she had this idea that kids wouldn't learn how to love reading and therefore writing if they had to, be given a steady progression of books that got harder and kept challenging them, or if they had to bother with silly things like learning the basic building blocks of literacy. And for whatever godforsaken reason, the public schools ran with this and started employing her curriculum. And she has been like a figurehead for some time. She's made a ton of money off of this. She has multiple companies. She's gone global. But her empire is starting to fall. And that's because the chickens are coming home to roost. Americans are getting dumber. Literally, IQ scores are falling. And when it comes to test scores for reading and math, in the gutter. So a lot of schools are starting to toss out her curriculum. I love that they call this vibes-based literacy because that just perfectly encapsulates everything about this. It turns out when you use emotions versus facts to teach, it doesn't go so well. And again, you can look at the scores of homeschool kids that were not being forced to learn in this way and see that they have not fallen. They're doing just great. So something's wrong with the public schools and specifically their curriculum, amongst many other things. Kids that suffer from dyslexia, kids who have English as a second language, have less language-rich homes, they have especially suffered under this. And those are years of academic achievement that you can't just make up. And this is one reason school choice is needed like yesterday. Monopolies, which is what the government has over public education, they stifle competition and they allow bad ideas to thrive for a lot longer than they would in the free market when people can vote with their feet and remove their kids from bad environments. And I seriously doubt Calkins is the only grifter ruining public schools in this manner.
Now, as I said in the video, the chickens are coming home to roost. Her curriculum is fortunately beginning to be pushed out of the public school system, but the damage has been done. And I haven't seen what curriculum they are now adopting that would replace it. So my hope that they're like bringing in hooked on phonics is pretty low. Again, it's the government making these decisions. Teaching kids to sight read is not reading. It's not good enough. It's not acceptable. And I'm so glad I'm finally seeing more and more educators themselves call this out.
Y'all have probably seen the videos talking about kids can't read nowadays, 7th graders reading at a 4th grade level, kids don't know their ABCs, kids can't read, and I wanted to talk about that. And the thing is, it's not just kids. 20% of adults in the United States are illiterate. Over 50% of adults can't read past an 8th grade level, so it's not just the kids. And there are many factors that play into it, but the factor I'm going to talk about is what happens in schools. The instruction in schools, mainly about sight words and not phonics, is the issue. Last year I was in a kindergarten classroom. You saw, you talked about, you heard, you looked at sight words every single day. There was one time in one of the teaching guides that was talking about holidays being sight words like Christmas, and I wanted to ask, is Christmas actually a sight word? Because I had never heard of that until then. I mean, by definition, I guess you could consider Christmas to be a sight word, but let me know what y'all think. Is Christmas actually a sight word? Because I'm still on the fence about that. But anyway, I think schools should move away from doing sight words all the time and go into a more phonics-based curriculum because, again, it's nothing wrong with knowing sight words, but when you talk about sight words and teach about it 80% of the time, that's where it becomes an issue because that's based on memorization. Memorization versus actually decoding, sounding out, and figuring out what a word is, those are two different things. And everybody knows it's better to actually understand what you're doing than to memorize what you're doing because you memorize something, you could easily forget it, especially when it comes to literacy. So that's something that needs to change. We can learn about sight words later, but phonics should be the main priority and at the forefront.
He is absolutely right. Phonics have to be at the forefront of reading education, and parents have got to start instilling the importance of really digging into the material, learning to read, put it into practice, make sure that your kid is actually engaging with literature on a daily basis if possible. A lot of your kids' outlook on reading will be determined in the home. Lastly, I want to address one last thing because I have a feeling this will come up in the comments. I do want to point out that the reading issues we're seeing are indicative of the public school system. We are simply not seeing these same problems in the private school system or in the homeschool system in this country. In fact, the average private school mean reading score was 18.1 points higher than the average public school mean reading score, according to my data. The government runs absolutely nothing efficiently. It is always going to take a lot more money to do even the most simple of tasks. It is always going to have corruption with those dollars. It is always going to protect people who should be fired. It is never going to have the incentives or disincentives of an actual market capitalist system. And so there's no reason for it to have to produce better and better results. I can't point to any single service or good the government is involved with delivering where it does a better job than the private industry market would do. And that is why I think it is so vital that we pass school choice laws across this country. Now, my ultimate dream would be to see the government get entirely out of education. I want to see a system where kids are actually taught how to think, where they're given the tools to stand up, to fight back. I don't see the government ever providing that. School choice is not a policy that will lead to that. You will hear many people on the left say this will be the end of public schools, blah, blah, blah. Unfortunately, most people are not in my camp. They tend to like their public schools. And in states where we have seen these policies passed, there's been no massive closure of schools. It tends to just be the absolute worst schools in the state. And if the parents feel that that is such a bad environment for their kids that they want to get them out of there, I think it's pretty corrupt to want to hold them hostage in a failing school system just to protect the administrators and other people who benefit financially from that system existing. As a whole, though, this just gives parents more choice, the ability to customize their kids' education, and the ability to actually hold these institutions accountable when they are failing to deliver the thing they are promising to deliver. Competition and the threat of those tax dollars being removed are the only thing that are going to improve the situation. And as the Brookings Institution said throughout their report, it is essential, imperative that we do something now, ASAP, because the current generation that is coming up will be the workforce of tomorrow. And if they lack these basic skills, we are in major trouble as a country. All right, guys, that's a wrap. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next week. If you like this video, don't forget to check out others in my series, Hannah Explains It All, here, and you can watch my other weekly show, Histrionics, here.